And boy, oh boy, do I have just a great example of this here for you. This is new. Now, I have to shout out, I believe it was the guys on the Vanguard, Zac and Gavin. They called this before it happened. They said, I think there's going to be like a Christian arc coming from Joe Rogan, because that's the trajectory he's on. You know, he went from like hippie adjacent pot smoking liberal, and then he evolved into the enlightened centrist role, and then he evolved further into just standard right-wing MAGA guy. And if you're continuing on that trajectory, where do you end up? Well, one of the things you can embrace is fundamentalist Christianity, right? Because he's attracted now a mostly right-wing audience.
The Vanguard will be there, sir.
I guess with all that being said, Gavin, we can plow right into the topic du jour, the major headline. Pretty exciting stuff. So about 2 or 3 days ago, I think it was right after you left, Gavin, you were getting on the road. We got a message from Kyle Kulinski, and he was like, holy shit. It's kind of a name drop, but it's relevant. He was like, holy shit, I can't believe Joe Rogan went full Christianity. Didn't you guys have a show about this where you were speculating if that was going to happen? And we were like, yeah, we were speculating because he was really into the mushroom thing back in the day. He wrote that famous article, Santa Claus was a mushroom. A lot of people have written articles about how Christianity might have been started by people who were tripping off of psychedelics, all those kinds of things. So I just thought it was in the air. That, and of course the just insane amount of money that's being pushed towards the right wing right now to
Sorry.
Oh no, you're good. Just insane amount of money that's being pushed towards the right wing to kind of go Christianity. We saw Tucker Carlson do it. He started talking about how he was mauled by a demon in his sleep. And I think that might be the episode where we first started speculating whether or not Joe Rogan would relent and go down this rabbit hole as well. Then you have Russell Brand obviously raking in a ton of cash by going on his Christian pivot. And it seems now Joe Rogan is following suit. Pretty crazy.
Yeah, so we're going to get into this by way of that secular talk video. Can't wait to hear Kyle's comments plus the Vanguard shout out, because you're right, Zach. We have been calling this for a while. We've been talking about how kind of not just Joe Rogan, but I think weirdly the whole sort of cohort of people that got really into the anti-vax stuff, Zach. I think that's who you can really pinpoint as a specific group that's really embracing this new Christian brand. Obviously, Jimmy Dore comes to mind. We've talked about that. We talked about how Jimmy Dore like quit pot, started talking a lot about God, started talking a lot about his dreams and his Jungian self and all this crap, right? Definitely pandering to that more spiritual energy, but directly to Christians. Jimmy's talked a lot about God recently. Then, of course, Russell Brand hit, and he went full Christian. So ridiculously, cartoonishly Christian, in such an unsubtle way that it's honestly hilarious. He's a caricature of a grifter in the religious, industry. But there he is. He's going full steam ahead. And now we have Joe Rogan, apparently, reportedly attending church consistently. So that's pretty funny. And it says here in this article, Joe Rogan recently voiced skepticism about the Big Bang theory of evolution and is repeatedly attending church on a regular basis. The 57-year-old Rogan, one of the most prominent podcasters in popular media, is attending church consistently. And then they go on here to talk about this idiotic quote where he's talking about the Big Bang. I'll try to see if I can find that. But yeah, Zach, what was your initial reaction to this? Because, it is predictable. We predicted it, but it's still just so stupid and unfortunate.
Yeah, it's crazy because while we did predict it, I think when we were both talking about it, it was a little bit in jest. It was like, now it's going to be like Joe Rogan. Like, we'll see how far Joe Rogan really falls all the way down to the Christian rabbit hole. Like, it was definitely on the table, but I also could have just as easily saw him kind of only flirting with it a little bit, right? Like, not going down the I'm regularly attending church. I think it represents a couple of things. I think you're very correct in pinpointing that this is the new chapter for the anti-vax people, because the anti-vax thing is completely dead now. Nobody cares about it. You can't talk about Fauci and get clicks anymore. You can't talk about vax skepticism and get clicks anymore. It's completely over. Nobody cares about COVID. Nobody cares about any of that anymore. So they need to find another way to move and compel people. And I think it's worth noting that historically the people who were into anti-vax stuff, and Gavin and I have talked about this on the podcast at length, were like the Gwyneth Paltrow's, right? It was like the crunchy, liberal, more like,
Williamson types.
The Marianne Williamson types, exactly. And what does Marianne Williamson also get really into? Spirituality. I'm thinking about like the Unitarian Christianity thing. I feel like they're trying to rebrand themselves in a lot of these, like, I'm a skeptic kind of a guy, or actually going more towards the traditional value set now. Like, oh, I'm an alpha male. I like working out. I like hunting. What's the other thing you can sell to those people? Bible, spirituality. So it's almost like the For the Husband kind of branding of spirituality now. You know what I mean? So you have like the Goop for a lot of women, but you've got the kind of Joe Rogan Christian, Russell Brand Christian for men. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're right. But it's unfortunate because like I don't have an issue with spirituality. I don't have an issue with people that are trying to embrace what they view as a higher power or something that they don't quite understand in the universe, something that helps them make sense of it all. I don't have an issue with that at all. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. What I do have an issue with is this sort of bullshit that now Joe Rogan is saying. Let's take a look at this quote, because Zach, obviously, we grew up in Kansas. We heard shit like this constantly ad nauseum throughout our young adult lives. So he's talking about the Big Bang Theory. And he says, it's funny because people will be incredulous about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but yet they're convinced that the entire universe was smaller than the head of a pin, and that for no reason that anyone has adequately explained to me, instantaneously became everything. Okay, Rogan said on a May 7th episode. In the conversation, which centered on the origin of the universe, Rogan asked whether the notion of the existence of nothing was logical. Wouldn't it be crazy if there wasn't something at one point in time? He asked, that seems even crazier than there has been something, there couldn't be nothing, then all of a sudden everything. So basically, this is one of the most tired cliches that you hear from Christians, but not just people that actually believe in Christianity. You hear this kind of shit from hacks like Ken Ham.
I was about to bring him up.
Yeah, this is exactly, he's just repeating like Ken Ham talking points. And it's so disappointing because, again, I don't have any problem with going on a spiritual journey. Joe Rogan has always kind of talked about, things that are outside of the realms of reality, right? Bigfoot and psychedelics and UFOs. Like, I don't have a problem with him talking about spirituality, but if his spiritual journey is just going to be repeating these stupid brain dead cliches, like, well, science is pretty hard to understand, so might as well just believe in this archaic bullshit written in like the fucking dark ages from, all these years ago when people didn't even know where the sun went at night. Like, that really? Like, okay, we can ponder these existential questions. We can have these conversations. I don't have any like issue with that. But again, as someone who grew up in the Bible Belt and constantly heard shit like this dumb, refutation of the Big Bang Theory, you hear that shit in the context of people trying to ban it from being taught in schools. You hear it in the context of people trying to ban science from being taught in public education, right? This isn't the kind of deep thought that I expect from someone like Joe Rogan, who typically likes to consider himself someone who ponders questions and, is an anti-establishment thinker.
That is, I think, the biggest change in Joe Rogan, right? And I think Kyle does a great job of addressing that up front in his video. One of the things that drew myself in particular, and I think pretty much everybody, to Joe Rogan was his genuine sense of curiosity, his genuine curiosity for things that he didn't know, and his ability to ask questions that were sincere and also were just normal. Oh, yeah, that's a natural follow-up, right? He didn't feel the need to go and study something super in-depth before the guest came on. He was like, I'll just ask all of the natural questions that come up when this person is telling you about a complicated issue. I'll draw on what I do happen to know, and we'll go from there. And it really worked because you were able to kind of go along, and Joe would ask the kind of questions that you would want to hear the answers to. Now he doesn't seem to have that kind of curiosity. It's almost like he's dumbed down. And we've talked about this a lot, the Theo Vaughnification, the Asmongold-ification. People just want really dumb, shallow, surface level analysis that makes them feel good. So instead of Joe pointing out the obvious thing, which we all know he knows, that these are just stories, these are just fables, these are just parables. They're meant to help people who were from 2,000 years ago, lead a good life, not get sick from shellfish, not spread STDs. Okay, these kinds of deals. That's what it was meant to do. That's what it was meant to accomplish. Okay, now it's kind of irrelevant. These are
That's
a lot
why
of
they hated gay people in the Bible, you think, to prevent STDs?
I mean, one of the reasons why a lot of people say that they think that was originally put in the Bible is because the sexual act of sodomy at a time when there wasn't sexual protection was very likely to spread sexually transmitted diseases. So a lot of folks were like, that's one of the reasons why it became stigmatized at that time, and obviously prejudice and cultural power and all of these things.
But that makes sense.
Yeah,
that makes sense. That's interesting.
So now, yeah. So anyway, you could rationalize all of that, and you're like, okay, we don't need to like not eat shellfish anymore because that's a good way to make you sick, whatever. But you could also still talk about, let's talk about the dynamics of power in society. Let's talk about how we view the poor. Let's talk about how we view the marginalized. Let's talk about how we live with sincerity. Let's talk about acceptance, how to be more graceful. Right? These are all very legitimate conversations. And Joe Rogan used to understand how to separate that. He would talk about how, okay, yeah, angels probably aren't real, but I understand why people want to follow this as a guidebook for how to give themselves inner peace or whatever. And I feel like the conversations he used to have with guests like Duncan Trussell, who was one of my favorite regulars on the show, and I think a close personal friend of Joe Rogan's, was they would get deep on spirituality. They would talk about the visions they had on DMT together. They would talk about going in the float tank and like getting lost in their own thoughts. And they talked about like what makes this reality different than the reality that they're experiencing when they're on, psilocybin and, when they're on the spirit molecule DMT. Those kinds of conversations are interesting because they feel authentic and sincere. This feels like a kind of guy doing a pivot. And whenever you start feeling like a guy doing a pivot, you're never going to be as good.
But either way, interesting context for everything. Zach, do you want to get into this Kyle video now?
Yeah. You want me to check it up here?
Sure.
Let's take it out.
Things about Joe Rogan that made him such a powerhouse is that people seem to like his childlike curiosity. And I do mean that descriptor in the most positive way possible. And I felt this too, being on his show 5-6 times, however many I was on it, that he does, like, he really is inquisitive. He always wants to go deeper. He has this curiosity on a plethora of issues where he wants to understand them, right? And so that was one of the things that made his show big in the first place. But what's happened in recent years is he's functionally become the exact opposite kind of person. He is no longer curious. He is no longer interested. Any guest he has on, he goes right back to his standard rants about the left being authoritarian, wokeness being bad, COVID conspiracy theories being correct, Donald Trump triggering the liberals and ha ha he he, isn't that funny? Isn't that awesome? He's like a comedian, bro. Comedian brains are just different, man. We're just different breeds, bro. It's all the same conversations recycled over and over and over. And fundamentally, he has on a bunch of right-wing bullshitters. He himself has become a right-wing bullshitter. He invited Trump on and gave him a hot stone massage and then endorsed him afterwards. I know now he's trying to back away from this label of being MAGA, but there is no escaping it. You had him on. You didn't ask tough questions. You humanized him. You endorsed him. You went to the fucking inauguration. So it is what it is. This is who you are now. So he lost that.
I honestly forgot about that. He went to the fucking inauguration, dude. Fuck Joe Rogan. Fuck Joe Rogan.
100%, 100%. And obviously it's not just Republicans. We gave David Pakman a lot of shit for going to the White House and appearing in that photo op with Butcher Biden. You know what I'm saying? Like, unless you're freaking Bernie Sanders or whatever, you better not be treating a politician like that. You know what I mean? Unless you're talking about like, Zora, we had Zoran Mondami on and had a couple beers and had a good friendly softball chat like that. Yeah, whatever. But you're talking about freaking a Joe Biden, a Donald Trump, and you take your fucking 3-hour long interview opportunity to sit there and go, then yeah, no, you're a complete fucking shameless sellout.
Childlike curiosity. And boy, oh boy, do I have just a great example of this here for you. This is new. Now, I have to shout out, I believe it was the guys on the Vanguard, Zac and Gavin. They called this before it happened. They said, I think there's going to be like a Christian arc coming from Joe Rogan, because that's the trajectory he's on. You know, he went from like hippie adjacent pot smoking liberal, and then he evolved into the enlightened centrist role, and then he evolved further into just standard right-wing MAGA guy. And if you're continuing on that trajectory, where do you end up? Well, one of the things you can embrace is fundamentalist Christianity, right? Because he's attracted now a mostly right-wing audience. So before I show you what's happening now, look at how he used to talk about these issues. For the longest time, he would always say, like, I'm an agnostic. I don't know. I don't really believe in God. I don't really believe in religion. I'm agnostic. I'm humble. I don't know about the mysteries of the universe. It was his, like, default common sense perspective, right? And he used to say stuff like this. Here we go. This is from when he was talking to Richard Dawkins, probably the world's most famous atheist. This is from about 5 years ago.
One of the things that I really enjoyed about your book was when you explain to people that everyone who practices a religion is an atheist. You're just an atheist in regards to Zeus or Apollo.
Or the 999 other gods.
Yes,
right.
and that's a home run with this argument.
Yes.
Because
Some just go one god further.
Yes,
Yeah.
but that really is a home run, because this concept of, me and my friends jokingly would always say praise Odin when anything would happen that was pretty good or cool.
Yes.
We say praise Odin, and I started doing it online, and people really got into saying praise Odin about certain things.
I rather like that, yes.
Some people got mad at me. They actually got mad that you are mocking Christianity by saying praise
But of course
Odin.
you are. Why not?
I wasn't even really. I was just having fun.
Yes.
I was having fun because Odin seemed like a cool god. It's an old school god. It's the god of the Vikings.
Douglas Adams wrote a lovely book.
That is a good point, but you don't even have to go anywhere near as far back as Odin. Think about all the other gods and all the other religions that exist simultaneously and coexist with Christianity. That's the main question I have for super religious people. I'm like, have you actually studied all these other religions? Why did you arrive on the one that you did? Is it just because you were born in the continent where it's most popularly practiced? Or did you actually evaluate your options and decide that something about Christianity spoke to you more than Buddhism and Islam and Judaism and all the other religions that are out there, right? I just think it's always been pretty ridiculous. Again, not that I have any issue with people that practice, but I don't know. I've always thought that was funny too.
Yeah, I feel like I think that's a fair question for sure. I just think a lot of people's response to that would be part of what does connect them to their religion is the fact that it's an element that ties them to their culture and their ancestry, and the fact that it has been practiced by, the people where they were from does connect them to their lineage. And I think that is a big, powerful tool that religions use to recruit. The fact that this is a way for you to be connected to the generations that came before you and the generations that come after you and liberate yourself in the afterlife. I think it's not. It honestly strikes me personally as a little more weird, and I would be interested what you think of this when somebody, let's just say that I went and became like a Buddhist, right? Like I would just think like, oh wow, that's an interesting move for a white guy that was born in Kansas City, Missouri, to like go and just become a Buddhist, and start practicing intense Buddhism because I don't have any like ancestral connection to that culture.
I mean, fair enough, but if we're just talking about religion as a way to connect with your culture, then sure. For example, a lot of Jews consider themselves to be secular Jews. They only consider themselves to be Jewish in order to keep alive that tradition that their family, carried on, and they want to stay in touch with their history, which is totally understandable, even if they don't actually believe all the stories in the Old Testament. So in that way, I understand what you're saying, but I do think that if you're actually taking this seriously, if you actually are on a spiritual journey, yeah, it makes more sense to find the religion that speaks to your particular sensibilities rather than just defaulting to whatever is popularly practiced in your homeland. Like, I think that's ridiculous. And personally, I do think that Buddhism aligns a lot more with my sensibilities spiritually than Christianity. If I was ever to embrace a religion, I would much more likely embrace Buddhism than Christianity, because Buddhism is not about denying yourself all of this stuff. It's not about submitting. It's more so about being in tune with your karmic footprint and the people around you, not just the people, but the living things around you. It really does align more with me than anything in the Bible, frankly. So sure, it might be cringy.
Buddhism was a bad example because that's kind of a based religion. I should have picked something cringier like Mormonism or something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's more of just like a cult, honestly, from what I know about it. But either way, I think that every religion obviously is going to have something in it that you could latch onto. Like, you're going to find some truth in the Bible if you read it long enough. You're going to be like, oh yeah, no, that's pretty true. Jesus was right about that. Same with the Bhagavad Gita. Same with the Quran. Any of these texts, you're going to find something to latch onto. But I really do think if you're actually serious about taking on a religious lifestyle or believing, actually having faith in something, yeah, you should investigate the various options and not just default to whatever, like, you know, your ancestors believed in, because then like Greek people would just be like worshiping Zeus and stuff, and we would all agree that that's dumb.
True.
Called the long dark tea time of the soul, in which the Norse gods are part of it. And Odin in that book has got old and senile, and he just lies in bed all the time and asking for clean sheets every day. And Thor is out there doing mischief with his great hammer and things. At one point, Odin gets Thor super glued to the floor and thinks it's a wonderful story.
The vast number of different religions. The incredible number. I mean, how many actual religions are there?
Thousands.
Thousands.
Yes, I forget how many thousands.
And many of them share similar belief systems. And it's really interesting when you see how they're like, you know, the Noah's Ark story is very similar to the Epic of Gilgamesh. And there's so many that you see like, oh, they probably told this to someone else, and these people moved and
of course, yes,
it traveled on. And it's just amazing that concept is alien to people. When I was a boy, I was raised Catholic, and I had an aunt who was Jewish, and my uncle married my aunt, and he had to convert to Judaism. And it was like a big deal in the family. Everybody would talk about it. And there was no anger. Everybody loved my aunt. She's a great lady. But it was just strange that he was converting to this other religion. I remember I was 5 years old when this was going on, and I was like, wait. What do you mean another religion?
Yes, quite.
I was like, what's going on?
Yes.
And they were like, oh, she's Jewish. I go, what does that mean? What do you mean she's Jewish?
Yes.
And they had to explain it to me.
Yes.
And I go, okay, but she believes in God. Like, yeah, they believe in God. Okay, so why is it a different thing? Well, they believe Jesus was a different kind of a thing. They don't necessarily believe he was the God that we think he was.
But if it had been Hindu, they'd have had to explain to you they believe in hundreds of gods.
Vishnu and
yes.
Yeah, and then we'd have to go way back. Yeah. It's just when you first hear that, I mean, that was probably put the first seeds of doubt in my head when I was a young boy. When I was like, wait, well, there's more than one? Like, I'll never forget that moment.
Do you remember when you decided you were an atheist, Gavin? Because I feel like one of the things that you and I have in common is that we both kind of came to that conclusion, or at least you at one point consider yourself an atheist at a young age. Do you remember what the catalyst for that was?
Probably watching a shit ton of amazing atheist videos, Cult of Dusty. No, I mean, it was definitely that, but also I think just a culmination of, like I said, growing up in the Bible Belt, all of the post 9/11 bullshit, you know, racism towards Muslims that we witnessed, religion being used to justify the persecution of, you know, same-sex couples in America. Like that was all just so, you know, in our face growing up in Kansas, I feel like constantly. And at a certain point, probably around 8th or 9th grade, I was just like, yeah, fuck it. Partially just in a sort of reactionary way, but like, yeah, I'm going to be the one kid here who's like not down with this. I'm going to push back. I'm going to, you know, piss people off and start arguments in the school bus on the way home from class, you know, testing people and shit. Like that was just kind of what I decided. But yeah, I don't know if there was like a specific moment. Was there for you?
I remember I had an older stepbrother that I was living with at one point when I was in 7th grade, and he told me he didn't believe in God. And I was like, what? That's crazy. Because I'd never really met anybody at that point that didn't believe in God, at least passively. And my mom had taken me to church a few times, and my grandparents were really religious, but it never really stuck with me. And I was like, what do you think happens to you when you die? And he was like, you go on the fucking ground, dude. What happens to you when you're sleeping? Nothing. You're just not thinking. Yeah, imagine that forever. And it blew my
dreaming.
Well, yeah, that's true. But if you know what, it like conveyed it to me, right? Like when you're asleep and nothing's happening, you're just like, oh yeah, it is a darkness, right? And then I was never able to rationalize any of the other arguments more than that. And so then I was in 7th grade, and then part of it was I enjoyed being the I'm an atheist, fight me kid at Indian Trail Middle School. Gavin, I believe you were the I'm an atheist, fight me kid at Pioneer Trail. So it's only natural that we joined forces and began a show down the line.
Yeah, I remember also that movie. There's a couple documentaries like Jesus Camp. I don't know if you've seen.
Yeah, you were
that.
really into that. I remember that.
Yeah, Jesus Camp, and again, Jesus Camp is about a church that's in, I think, Lee Summit, Kansas. Like the actual camp, the summer camp takes place in like, I forget, Wisconsin or some shit like that. But the church that puts it on is in Lee Summit. So yeah, that was basically our whole upbringing, was being surrounded by that. I remember I had teachers at school that, you know, would say shit like, you know, being Muslim is a sin, and they would like deny evolution and talk about all this crazy
we
stuff.
all had teachers, I think, that denied evolution for sure. People don't realize that. I remember we literally were getting read a picture book when I was in school one time, and one of the things talked about evolution, and the teacher literally skipped over it and was like, I don't believe in none of that. was Miss Gardner. That was the same woman that was like, I will die knowing that Pluto was a planet, even though Pluto is not a planet. I remember her and I got into a really big argument about it in class, and I had to go sit in the hallway afterwards. So shout out to Miss Gardner. I do believe she passed from cancer. She was a nice woman, but she had some crazy beliefs.
That sucks. Yeah, you would hear shit like that all the time. I remember there was one guy who would sometimes come to our elementary school and give presentations about his travel. And one thing he would always say that stuck with me is, and I don't care what anyone says, Columbus discovered America.
That guy was cool, except for that, though. You know what I mean? That's a bummer. Because until you just said that, I was gonna be like, I remember that guy. That guy was cool. And then you're like,
He was.
Oh, no.
He was cool. I remember thinking, I was like, damn, this guy has a cool job. He just travels around.
Takes pictures of shit. He's been to Australia. You know, I remember thinking that was like the best assembly because I wanted to travel so much when I was a kid.
It might have put the seeds in our head.
Yeah. Anyway.
Because we're all sitting around the dinner table, and I was just a little kid. And I'm thinking, what do you mean there's another one?
I think that's a very powerful way of getting to children, is to just simply tell them that.
Yes.
Telling them nothing but facts. You're not indoctrinating them.
Right.
You're just telling them. There are lots of different religions, and Hindus believe in hundreds of gods, and Jews believe in one God, and Muslims believe in one God, and they don't believe in Jesus. And
So that's how he used to talk about it. This clip goes on, but that's how he used to talk about it. Just like a sort of default atheism or agnosticism where he questions everything because he's curious, and he's talking about how the stories don't add up. They really don't make any sense. These seem like ancient myths. Very clearly, he's anti-theist here. In other words, he doesn't think any particular religion is true. And as I always say, anti-theism in the sense that you don't believe all these different religions are true or one of them is true, that is like the most logical perspective. I can totally understand somebody who might disagree with me and believe in God or just believe in something beyond them. Like, I totally get that. That I can level with. But I do not, by any stretch of the imagination, I cannot perceive of somebody signing up for one particular religion among 4,000 or more. Why? Because, like, you were raised with that from your mom and dad, so you happen to be correct. You happen to be the one that's right out of the thousands of all of them throughout history. It just seems so arrogant to me and, like, really deeply intellectually incurious, right?
Well, to my response to that would just be like, duh. Like, and I don't mean that in a negative way, although I'm sure that's how it's going to come across. Like, I think for a lot of people, religion is inherently anti-curious, right? You are choosing to believe that this one book, this one scripture encloses all of the worldly answers. That stems from a lack of curiosity. That comes from a limited perspective. That comes from a lack of examination and a lack of curiosity, right? Why would you just believe that? So to me, that's like an obvious point. It's like, of course, they are not curious. They've been told and they since believe because it's easier for most people to believe that I can find the answer to everything in this one book. And it also connects me to my culture. And it also makes me feel like I'm part of a community because of the church congregation that I'm allowed to be a part of as a result of that. I feel like all of those things are at play together. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, 100%. I think that's ultimately what religion boils down to. It's an antidote to the fear and anxiety related to the unknown and related to that which we cannot understand. It says it's okay, don't worry about that. You don't have to think too hard about it. It's all explained here, like you said.
And so he's got this default anti-theistic perspective, but as you all know, as time has gone by, he likes inviting on right-wing guest after right-wing guest after right-wing guest. It doesn't matter what field. It could be MMA. They could be a comedian. They could be a pundit. They could be an actor. But it's like just a constant flow of right-wing guests. And so when you're in the environment of everybody around you believes the same stuff and they say the same things and they're all Trump supporters, you saw him change over time. And now we get stuff like this. Take note of how different this sounds. Ready? Here we go.
Well, space is the ultimate who the fuck knows because we can only see so far. We see so far, but even so far is only so far.
Well, and then they're saying like it's always expanding, which that can't be true because like what is it expanding into? If space is space, you know, if they're like, oh, it's like blowing up a balloon where everything's okay, but you're blowing up a balloon in a room,
right?
So what's the room that you're blowing the balloon into? And then that's in a bigger room, and then that's in this.
And then there's the concept that it's actually finite. And it's not infinite, and it's some sort of donut shape. It like goes back around eventually.
But then who made all that?
Right.
Like, is there a God? Did God make this?
Or is God the universe?
Yeah, but then who made God? And then that
God, your mom.
Why would that bother you? By the way, I think this guy's a Christian. He's had a bunch of like weird Christian apologetics people on lately. That, to me, that's the trump card, no pun intended, of people. Oh, the world is so complex, so you needed a God to create it because the complexity is too much for it to just happen naturally. That's the argument. But you just got to go one step further and say, okay, well, who created that God? Because obviously that God, by definition, would be more complex than the world and the universe and everything in it, because they had the ability to create the world and the universe and everything in it. So they have to be even more complex. So then by your own logic, who was the super God that created the God?
By the way,
again,
Zach,
who was the super...
This just reminded me, but speaking of, did you happen to see Jordan Peterson getting absolutely fucking obliterated on Jubilee?
Bro, he had the exact opposite result of Sam Cedar. Sam Cedar went on there and kicked ass and blew up his profile. I think that was the final nail in the coffin for old JBP. I think the human lobster is cooked. I think his time in the sun is over. We've known his relevance was waning massively, but his whole brand of intellectualism, phony intellectualism, total horseshit intellectualism, is so far out of style. I think he's going to go the way of a Sam Harris. I think he's going to go the way of a Brett Weinstein. I think the intellectual dark web is over, and that was the last death rattle of it.
Oh, 100%, bro. I mean, I've been saying the dude's a pseudo, intellectual for a while. Basically, my whole is the first time I came into contact with him, I was like, seriously, people actually think this guy's smart? Like, this is a classic example of who a dumb person thinks is a smart person, But it is glorious to see all that finally crumbling and it all just exposed that the emperor has no clothes.
One of the things I'll never forget about Jordan Peterson is he was the first one to really popularize the carnivore diet because his daughter, who's also dumb as rocks, went on it way back in the day. And I remember I was sitting in, this was back when I had like family health insurance, right? And I was sitting in my doctor's office and I asked her what she thought of the carnivore diet and she laughed. And I was like, well, this guy, there's a couple of doctors. And she was like, no, honey. Some people go to medical school when they're in their 20s and then they decide they don't want to be doctors and they have to find a different way to pay off their student loans. And that's how you get stupid shit like the carnivore diet, which always kind of fucking stood out in my head.
Yeah, it's so dumb. Either way, sorry for the tangent. Let's get back to this Kyle video.
Super God who created the super God who created the God who created us. The logic falls apart. And notice, there's no attempt to even react to it. He's just like, oh, I hate that. Well, I don't care if you hate it. It's logically sound, and it makes sense to me. Are you even going to try to rebut it, or are you just going to, you believe it when the atheists say that, bro?
Not a thing that we think that, like, because we were born and we die, that we have these biological limitations that we attach to the universe itself.
That's fair.
Right.
That we see things as being built and destroyed.
That there's always been something. Wouldn't it be crazy if there wasn't something at one point in time?
Yeah.
That seems even crazier. Then there
Right.
always has been something. Because if it's just something, if it's just the nature of everything, there is always something, right?
Right.
It couldn't be nothing and then all of a sudden everything. That
Right.
seems
Because what started that? What kicked that off?
Exactly.
What snapped its fingers?
that's McKenna's great line. Terrence McKenna had a great line
Yeah, it's called the Big Bang. They put it right in the name for dumbasses like you to be able to fucking remember.
about the difference between science and religion is that science only asks you for one miracle. I want you to believe in one miracle, the Big Bang.
Yeah. That's a good one.
It's a great line.
You know what Joe Rogan used to say all the time on this podcast? It used to be one of his favorite lines ever. Sorry, my mouth is dry. But he used to always come out here and he used to say, you guys, one of the jokes I used to like to tell all my friends in the 90s was, do you guys know the difference between a cult and a religion? Yeah, a cult is a guy and he's got this crazy idea and he gets a bunch of people to follow him, right? And in a religion, that guy's dead. That's what Joe used to say. Like, it was a creative, original joke. He used to bring it out on the podcast like once every 4 months. It was in his, recycled, one-liners. And yeah, why?
Also,
he thought religion was stupid. But yeah, go ahead, Gavin.
Right. No, that's so true. But also, I just hate how Rogan also evoked Terrence McKenna there. Terrence McKenna would fucking spit on what you're doing right now, Joe Rogan. Fuck you for appropriating that quote, which had nothing to do with like your stupid Christian propaganda that you're now embarking on. Terrence McKenna would have been, embarrassed by what you're doing. He would have thought it was humiliating.
Yeah.
It's because it really is true.
Yes.
And it's funny because people would be incredulous about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but yet they're convinced that the entire universe was smaller than the head of a pin, and for no reason than anybody's adequately explained to me. It makes sense.
Yeah. No.
Okay, go ahead and explain how Jesus came back to life. Go ahead. While you're making comparisons, while you're saying there's no evidence for either thing, bro, it's a wash. Go ahead and take your best crack at convincing me that Jesus died and then came back 3 days later.
Yeah, that's like I said, that's the Kinham argument. All of this like pseudo intellectual, like, hits blunt kind of talk. Unfortunately, now it's just leading to this stupid Kinham talking point. And that's the difference between the old Joe Rogan and the new Joe Rogan. I think distilled right there, because again, up until this point, talking about, well, isn't science and magic kind of just the same thing, bro? Like science is just explaining magic. Like that's nothing new for Rogan. But then taking that next step right directly into the fucking like decades old Kinham Creation Museum talking points. Like he just got out of the fucking gift shop. You know what I'm saying? Like, come on, bro. It's so unoriginal. It's tired. It's cliched. It's the least interesting presentation of Christianity, quite frankly. And there are interesting presentations and perspectives on the Christian religion. This isn't one of them. This is some bullshit 20 years old Bible Belt excuse to not teach science in classrooms.
Yeah, Silly and Billy might have to take a road trip to the Museum of Creation and learn all you fine folks.
Instantaneously became everything.
He's getting close. He's getting close to just doing the full Christian bit here. So now he's comparing the Big Bang to the resurrection of Jesus, and he's trying to make it seem like, well, obviously the Big Bang is equally as absurd, if not more absurd, than the resurrection of Jesus. The difference is there's actual evidence for the Big Bang, and there's really not for the resurrection of Jesus. So that's the difference, right? But he's not done yet.
Actually, Kyle, I was in New Mexico the other day. I walked by a storefront that claimed to have the Shroud of Turin. So I don't know, bro. That seemed like some evidence to me.
I can't buy that.
I'm sticking with Jesus on that one. Like, Jesus makes more sense.
I'm sticking with Jesus. Jesus makes more sense. One more time.
Well, space is no reason than anybody's adequately explained to me. It makes sense.
Yeah. No.
Instantaneously became everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't buy that.
I'm sticking with Jesus on that one.
Yeah.
Like, Jesus.
So he can't buy the Big Bang. He's sticking with Jesus.
And also
makes more sense.
I imagine that Kyle's going to make this point, but if you're really sticking with Jesus, then that's like contrary to everything you've been talking about and standing for politically over the last couple of years, bro. You think Jesus would be a Trump supporter? You think Jesus would be cool with endorsing all of this absolute cruelty and barbarism, specifically towards the exact group of marginalized people that Jesus consistently preached, to help? People like the homeless, for example. Like, it's crazy.
What happened to that old Joe Rogan? The old Joe Rogan, who was anti-theist, and he had repeated multiple times on his show that he's agnostic. He just doesn't know. He says, maybe there's a God, maybe there's not a God, but I don't know. And I'm not really convinced by anything I've seen. Now, he's saying the Big Bang is ridiculous and the resurrection of Jesus is more legitimate, even though the evidence is the exact opposite direction, where there actually is evidence for the Big Bang, and there's no evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Okay, ready? We're not done. So then he has this guy on. Again, this guy's a super Christian dude. And here's what they say.
I really like the way that Jordan Peterson articulates it, but I think he misses the forest for the trees.
How so?
In that he sees Jesus as an archetype. And I don't think actually even Jesus gives you the opportunity to see him as the archetype. Because I have this love-hate relationship with all of Peterson's stuff, because he seems to get so much right where he walks up to the line, but he doesn't want to cross over. And
is the crossover, you think, connected to a life in academia? Or?
So do you understand what he's saying there? He's saying, I love that Jordan Peterson flirts with Christianity, basically effectively argues that Christianity is true, but he refuses to say, I think Jesus Christ is our Lord and Savior and he was resurrected. That's the point this guy's making. He's like, why don't you just say that Jesus Christ is our Lord and Savior?
What do you think it is?
I wonder, and I'd love to talk to him about this, like, how do you remedy this issue that, because he seems to think that the concept of Jesus as an example is more important than the actual flesh and blood first century itinerant Jewish preacher who was crucified and rose from the dead physically, which is the claim of the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament.
So see, this guy, the whole point of this guy is to do Christian propaganda. Joe wanted to have a conversation with a guy who's doing Christian propaganda, who's arguing the resurrection of Jesus Christ was literal.
That's what's crazy about it, because as you mentioned, Gavin, there are people who devoutly follow the Christian religion, but they do it in a serious way where they understand that these are parables and they're using it as a way to connect themselves to this, idea, this theory of Jesus, right? And a lot of times people who take their religion really deeply and seriously, they'll like refer to the writings of saints, right? They'll refer to the writings of other people who have over time reinterpreted the original scripture and made it more robust and more about living a real, life of commitment and bettering others and all of these kinds of things. I'm thinking about people like Cornel West, people, who you could have all your opinions about him. I believe his, commitment to Christianity is sincere, right? All of those kinds of things. But then you have these assholes over here and they're literalists. They're actually trying to convince you that the things that are said in the Bible are true. Like, there was a rib taken to make Eve and all of this other fucking shit, or the other way around. I'm not an expert on the Bible, but the snake bit and the apple from the knowledge tree, all that shit they think actually happened, which I thought as a society we had pretty much moved past. So I'm pretty alarmed to see somebody like Joe Rogan get fully in the tank for that. And maybe I should have been smarter and I should have seen that coming. But my whole life, I've just been convinced that one day I'm going to be an adult and everybody else is going to be like, oh, yeah, like we're leaving that whole literal interpretation of religion behind. But it never happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly. And that's sort of the difference between just like a normal, sane Christian and a real creationist, right? And that's, again, the strain of religion that I find to be so annoying because it's used to bludgeon science. It's just a bludgeon truth. And it's like, it's cool if you have faith in something. I understand that that's the whole point. But yeah, this is ridiculous. And to see Rogan dabble in that kind of Christianity rather than the first kind is, again, disappointing, because I wouldn't have a problem with it if he was like, you know what? I was reading the New Testament and Jesus really had a lot of good things to say. I really appreciate his defense of the immigrant and of the prostitute and of the criminal. Like that would be an interesting direction for Joe to go in. He probably should, really study the teachings of Christ. Give away all his money. It's easier for a camel to enter an eye of a needle for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Have you got to that part in the Bible yet, Joe? Have you made it that far?
That's an example for us to look on and live by. But I actually think that Jesus condemns moralism. And ultimately what I see Peterson doing is looking at Jesus as a moral example. And if Jesus is nothing but a moral example, then you can save yourself and you don't actually need a savior.
See what he's saying? So Jordan Peterson, you don't go far enough. You need to be more Christian. You need to think the Bible's literally true. You need to think Jesus literally rose from the dead. Why are you just flirting with Christians and acting like Christians are the best and Christians are the most moral and Christians have a good story at the core of their religion, and that's why you should sort of be in league with them? Why don't you just go further and say, Jesus is our God?
And so I think actually Jesus would have critiqued that, because Jesus was very against moralism.
And how do you define Jesus being against moralism? Like, what do you mean by that exactly?
Jordan Peterson?
Wait, what?
Did you just say Jesus would critique Jordan Peterson?
Yeah, I think this guy over here is like a proto-fascist actually underneath it all. He's like Jesus condemns moralism. All you need to do is obey. All you need to do is abandon any of your critical. My problem with Jordan Peterson is he still allows the narrow element of critical thinking into his text, and you need to convince everybody that you are supposed to receive answers, not ask questions.
Yeah, I will say though, I do. From the opposite side, I do kind of share that critique of Jordan Peterson. I think it's ridiculous how he wants to have it both ways and claim to, I'm not actually a Christian, but I'm going to shit all over atheism and I'm going to constantly defend Christianity's place in society and say ridiculous things like, no great art would exist without Christianity or something. He said stupid shit like that, but then he literally won't actually go as far as to identify as a Christian. So I will say it is kind of annoying that he wants to have it both ways. And he got brutally called out for that in the Jubilee debate in hilarious fashion. I can try to find that clip.
Well, Jesus looks at the religiosity of his day with like particular groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are these other groups of Jews during his day. So we talked about the Essenes, actually aren't mentioned in the Bible, but there are other groups like the Pharisees, who are like lay scholars, and the Sadducees, who are professional priest scholars. And he's constantly critiquing the fact that they have this hypocritical religiosity to them, where they're doing things like tithing their mint leaves, like to make sure that they get all of, this is where we get the idea of the letter of the law versus the intention of the law. Like Jesus critiques them for that because he says, you're trying to do everything right and you're missing the point. So one of the things he says is like, if your donkey falls in a ravine on the Sabbath, do you pull it out? Or does that work? Like, what's the point of the Sabbath? Is it to not do any work? Like, is it to make sure that you're not working too hard because you might be breaking the Sabbath? Or like, what is the point? He says, like, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And that there's this intention. This is the whole Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, is he keeps saying, you have heard it said, but I say, and he refers to the Mosaic law. And it looks like he's critiquing the Mosaic law, but he's not actually. He's getting back to the intention of the law. So
See, my thing about the Bible is when people talk about stupid shit like this, why couldn't I just trot out a copy of the Canterbury Tales, right? And be like, see, this is what's written in between the lines. When you read chapter 7, line 42, we're about the miller. He's clearly talking about temptation. He's talking about the pursuit of someone else. It's just crazy that like all of these are just made up fables. So obviously, to see these grown men be having these conversations about it as if it actually happened and it's actually relevant to 2025 is just deranged to me.
It is. Also, I get really bad vibes from whoever the fuck this guest is. I'm like, you seem like some, like at best, like a youth group leader or something. But I don't know. If I was really going to have an interesting conversation about these topics, about religion, I would have on someone who's actually spent their life as like a leader in the, in their, whatever their community is, a religious leader, someone who actually has a, past as a real spiritual leader, not just this fucking grifter piece of shit. I don't even know who this guy is.
Yeah, he definitely gives unlikable. That's for sure. He kind of is like, he looks like he couldn't cut it as a mercenary, so he had to start hawking religion for a living.
He says, you have heard it said, do not commit murder. But I say to you, anybody who harbors a hate for their brother in their heart has already committed murder. And what he's getting to is like, what's the intention? What's the meaning of the law that God gives to you? Because the law is like a mirror. It shows you how dirty you are. But his critique is he's like, you guys are trying to clean yourself with a mirror. That's stupid. It's just if anything, it's gonna make you more messy. Like, get in the shower. The law is not what cleans you. The law is what reveals that you're dirty. And so in that sense, I think, if Jesus is a moral example, it actually misses what I think Jesus actually said about what his purpose was.
So in other words, he's our literal God. Stop just using him as an example and an archetype in a story and go all the way. Join the cult.
In that you can't do enough to actually live up to the standard that God holds you to. And so if you keep striving, you're actually going to wear yourself out and be exhausted.
Like atheists.
Little shot of atheists at the end there. These dirty atheists trying to like be moral and good within the context of the law. Like, obviously you just have to believe in Jesus.
What do you think the chances are that some of Joe Rogan's newfound animosity towards atheism has to do with his old friend Kyle Kulinski of Secular Talk getting a shit ton of views, racking up tons of attention, taking fat shits all over him and his channel?
Woo! Kyle, you might have made Rogan a Christian. I'm gonna hold Kyle responsible for this. Kyle, you did the pivoting. One of the things that I was briefly chatting with Kyle about the other day, Gavin, was that Joe Rogan might seriously be responsible for a big part of why, the entire media apparatus goes one direction or the other, right? And he kind of proved that with the Donald Trump interview, right? You watched Rogan say it's okay to do Donald Trump, so then Theo Vaughn's out there doing things with Donald Trump. Andrew Schultz is out there doing things with Donald Trump in a way that he hadn't in the past. Like, all these guys go forward with it. Do you think that now that he's going full all the way out there with Christianity, that we're going to see people who you would never dream about doing Christianity, like, try and get in on that because they were watching the Rogan gravy train go down? You know what I mean? Like, do you think we're going to start watching Theo Vaughn talk about how he's like grew up in the South and like now he, loves Jesus? Do you think the Flagrant guys, they're going to start talking about how they've been trying to better themselves by praying in the morning, by doing these kinds of things just as a way of virtue signaling to Rogan's masses that they're still one of them? Or do you think this is where Rogan goes the boomer route and that next generation of people kind of take over?
Oh, that's a good question. It is hard for me to see a guy like Theo Vaughn doing this, but then again, a couple of years ago, I would have said the same thing about Rogan himself, and a couple of years before that, I would have said the same thing about Jimmy Dore, right? So I'm never not shocked, by how low people can go, and I wouldn't be surprised at all. To be honest, though, I am. It almost does make sense though that this is happening, because it's like, I remember I said this when Trump got reelected. I was like, people want to act like this is some new populist form of right-wing energy. I was like, no. I was like, welcome back to the Bush era. And I think that this is kind of proof that I was right about that, and that people that said that were right, because now we see the right wing once again embracing Christianity, just boring, basic bullshit talking points right out of Ken Ham's playbook, right? And it's like, yeah, that does remind me a lot of the sort of post 9/11 Bush era. We're right back there. This is not some new anti-establishment anything. This is just going a reversion back to that. And again, it does kind of feel almost natural, like that's how it should be. It got kind of weird for a while.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Ready for this? Here's the cherry on top for this story. This was just reported. Joe Rogan starts going to church as faith resurgence gains momentum, Christian apologist claims. So that's this guy who we just listened to. This guy's a Christian apologist. Joe invited him on, had a conversation with him, and this guy on his own show came out and said, Rogan has started to go to church, and he does it every week. Quote, I can tell you for a fact that Rogan is attending a church, and that has been a consistent thing. Christian apologist Wesley Huff claimed. His transformation is complete. He's gone full MAGA Republican. He's going full fundamentalist Christian. And everybody who said that trajectory is right 9 out of 10 times, they are correct. Because this has been a fatal flaw of mine for the longest time, where I always take people at face value and what they say and what they believe, and I don't see the changes that lead to a trajectory where they end up at the logical endpoint of that trajectory. We went through this with Tulsi Gabbard. I thought Tulsi Gabbard, oh, she's a lefty, but she's got some criticisms of the Democrats, and but
and I'll give Kyle credit. This is Kyle being a really good guy, and my default is always to be like a cynical piece of shit. So that's why I'm always like, fuck this asshole immediately. You know what I mean? So different strokes. We need the Kyles of the world.
Fundamentally, she's not going to go all the way with the Republicans. She hates the Republicans too, right? Wrong. She just becomes a Republican. Now she's in the Trump regime. People like Jimmy Dore, who was criticizing Democrats from their left, and that was his whole shtick. But then eventually over time, the criticism, it just became all criticism of Democrats, no criticism of Republicans. And then eventually he dropped the facade and started making right-wing arguments. So the trajectory was, oh, I'm attacking the Democrats, but it's from the left, so I'm still a lefty too. Now I'm sort of an enlightened centrist, and all I do is attack the Democrats. To finally, now all I do is attack the Democrats, and I'm on the right, and I suck off Trump, right? There's so many examples of the trajectory starting and reaching its logical endpoint. And as I said, the guys over on the Vanguard, Zac and Gavin, they said Rogan is going to end up having like a Christian arc, right? Here it is. He already did the I'm a hippie liberal pot smoker, then it became I'm the enlightened centrist, then it became I'm MAGA curious, then it became I'm just MAGA, then he's a standard Republican, then it's Christian fundamentalism. And having on people like this on his show. Joe Rogan from 5 to 10 years ago would mock and laugh at the Joe Rogan of today, who brings on the world's most obvious charlatan snake oil salesman, religious freaks, to argue Jesus is literally the Son of God and has risen in Christianity is factually correct. One of the most laughable claims imaginable. What a fucking sad fall from grace, bro. He is so... I've never seen anybody... Well, that's not true. There's a lot of people who are mega washed. Russell Brand, Jimmy Dore, Joe Rogan. But this is like next level, bro. Next level. And thank God the Midas Touch people have dethroned him as the number one podcast, because this cannot continue. I mean, he's just like a Fox News grandpa now, bro. He's become a Fox News grandpa. It's one of the saddest things I've ever seen. And like I said, that childlike curiosity which made him interesting and made him number one, that is so gone now. He is the least curious person on the planet. And he's attracted to every charlatan, con man, grifter, snake oil salesman in the country. And he makes them prominent. And that's what we're witnessing here. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe.
Yeah, I mean, epic takedown by Kyle. I'd love to see that. And honestly, a little bit of a good throwback to retro Kyle. You know, he's secular talk for a reason. That guy is a fucking atheist, okay? Kyle's never going to come out here and be like, you know what, guys? I actually think I do believe in God. You know what I mean? It's not going to be him. So he's the perfect guy to do that takedown of Rogan. And the last thing I'll say, man, Richard Dawkins might be the most unlikable dude I've ever seen in my entire life. That energy that he gave off in that Rogan interview was just like, God, I agree with you, but I still hate you. Like,
The
what
one
is
from
your
like
deal,
5 years ago.
Yeah, I'm just like, what are you? And maybe it's because I know what I know about Dawkins now, and he's pissed me off a bunch on the internet. But I'm like, dude, fuck you. Like, you give off weird vibes.
Yeah, I feel like if you go back and see some Dawkins from like the 2000s, you might find like he sort of had that Hitchens energy, you know. But I agree, he's kind of gone off the deep end.
I loved, dude. And here's my other thing, man. I love watching some old Hitchens because Hitchens could be like a real caustic prick, but I love that. I love it when British people are fucking antagonists. I love it when they're
Same.
fucking like, you know, snippy. And Hitchens was so fucking smart, man. And, you know, we even had Ben Burgess on to talk about that one time when he wrote a book about Christopher Hitchens. Sucks that Hitchens fell off the deep end. He got cancer. He was an
They all
alcoholic.
do.
Yeah. Yeah. Not
It's
us.
so annoying.
We'll never die.
Exactly. But yeah, it's pretty much all those like atheist thinkers from, you know, Sam Harris to Dawkins. They all kind of went downhill at a certain point, which is a real bummer. But yeah, you know, I think Kyle was on point there. And again, I don't have any problem with people having faith, people having spiritual beliefs. But when it starts impeding on society, when it starts impeding on common sense and, you know, science being taught in schools and stuff, and that's where Joe Rogan's going. You know, denying the Big Bang Theory has nothing to do with your personal spiritual quest or spiritual fulfillment or spiritual enlightenment. It's just a dumb talking point trotted out by dumb people to pour cold water on something that you're too stupid to understand. Because and then that makes you feel insecure. The fact that you can't wrap your head around science, which is obviously an evolving theory. You know, the Big Bang Theory is not considered fact. It's an evolving theory. That's what science is. No one is claiming to have all the answers except for the religious people.
Look out the door if you hear an ambulance. The Vanguard will be there, sir. The Vanguard will be there, sir. The Vanguard will be there, sir. The Vanguard will be there. Be there. The Vanguard will be there.